Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to see students on the Thursday before fall break. You're so much more ambitious than I. Thank you all. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm really excited that Cal Poly Humboldt is the first place that Dr. Dana Lloyd gets to celebrate the publication of her brand new book, Land is Kin. I'm really excited to hear Dr. Lloyd's book talk this evening, and we have a special introduction from Judge Abby. So I'm super excited for this evening's programming. For those who don't know me, I'm Caitlin Reed. I am an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt, and I serve as our university's Traditional Ecological Knowledge Faculty Fellow and co-director of the Rude Gallagher Food Sovereignty Lab and TEK Institute, alongside the amazing Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldi, who's on sabbatical this year. Otherwise, we'd all be, so we're happy that she's taking her rest. And I just want to welcome all of you to the Decolonizing Sustainability speaker series. This speaker series, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, aims to highlight and unpack the intersections of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and systems of power, privilege, and oppression within the discourse and rhetoric of contemporary sustainability, environmental discourse, and climate change movements. This series is intended to serve as a deep dive into the problematic and harmful discourses of sustainability, with the goal of moving toward a decolonial sustainability movement that amplifies Indigenous sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge. If you're new to the speaker series, you can check out our past sessions on the Cal Poly Humboldt Native American Studies YouTube channel. One of my favorites is Nobody Asked You, John Muir. So if you haven't watched any, start with that one. It's my favorite. Our university, Cal Poly Humboldt, as you all know, occupies the unceded land of Wiyot peoples. This includes the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. Gutdini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods, was renamed Arcata by settlers in 1860. Despite this, Wiyot peoples maintain connections to their territory through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. Wiyot peoples are central to the history and future of this place. If you haven't already, I recommend you go to our YouTube channel and watch Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldi's What Good is a Land Acknowledgement, to think through kind of some of the performative politics of land acknowledgements. And so when we read land acknowledgements here at our university, we accompany them with action items, because to merely copy and paste one is meaningless, because Wiyot peoples already know whose land they are on. And so I have a couple action items for us today. My first couple are always free. I remember what it was like to be an undergrad. First thing, go follow the Wiyot tribe on all their socials, stay educated on events happening in their community, and answer calls to action and allyship when needed. Go follow the Native American Studies department and other Native programming on our campus via social media. Stay informed about cool events such as this one going on our campus. Faculty and staff in the room, you can pay the Wiyot honor tax. It goes directly to the Wiyot tribe. It is www.honortax.org. And lastly, you can donate to the Rude Gallagher Food Sovereignty Lab and TEK Institute. You can find that information on the Native American Studies webpage. I also want to say just a couple words about the space that we are gathered in today. So we are in the BSS building, Behavioral and Social Sciences, and this room specifically is called the Native American Forum. This building was constructed in 2007, and this entire space, including this space, the Native American Forum, which looks like a traditional plank house, as well as the entire first floor of the BSS building, was set aside for Native programming. However, over time, the university began to allocate those spaces for other interests on campus, and that is not an unfamiliar story, right, for Indigenous peoples here. And so in January of 2015, students had to occupy this space for over a week just for the university to call it the Native American Forum and ensure that it would be reserved for Native programmings and events on our campus, right? So students have done incredible work And that's worth clapping for. And it was because of this student activism, right, that this place is officially named and designated as the Native Forum. And then in October of 2019, we redid the lobby. So if you sped through, go and check out the lobby. We have some incredible murals, plaques with information about Native programming on campus, as well as the local Wiyot tribe. And so this is a really, really important space that we are on our campus. And last year, Ted Hernandez was giving a talk on campus and referred to this entire area of the university as Wiyot Plaza. Then the university was filling out forms for space requests, and they're like, hey, what's this place called? More like it's called Wiyot Plaza. So now it is officially named in the system, right? Wiyot Plaza. And this space includes many important spaces for Indigenous peoples, the Native American Forum, the Gutdini Native American Arts Gallery, as well as the Rue Delaguerre Food Sovereignty Lab and TEK Institute, which is set to open in early December. So we are super excited about that. So welcome to Wiyot Plaza. A couple of housekeeping notes. I know I've been talking a while. We'll get to the interesting stuff soon, I promise. Make sure you grab snacks and beverages in the lobby. We paid for them, so take all. Second thing, Northtown Books is set up in the lobby. They are selling copies of Land is Kin. They only have a limited supply because it's technically not published till tomorrow, I think. So we got early advance copies. You can't even get it online yet. So please go and take advantage of the books for sale in the lobby. After the talk today, there will be a Q&A session for us to engage in discussion with our featured scholar, Dr. Lloyd. So please save all your questions and comments till the end. And then following the Q&A, Dr. Lloyd will be available to sign copies of her brand new book, Land is Kin. So please make sure you stick around till the end so that you can get your book signed. I will introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Dana Lloyd, in just a moment. But before that, we have a really special treat this evening. Judge Abby is here. Judge Abby Avenatti of the Yurok tribe will kick us off this evening with some introductory remarks. Judge Abby needs no introduction, but I'm going to read it anyway because her accolades are amazing. Judge Abby Avenatti was the first tribal woman to pass the state bar and become a judge in California. Judge Abby has served as the Yurok Tribal Court Judge since 1997 and has proudly held the title of Chief Tribal Court Judge since 2007. She's a member of the Yurok tribe. She is an alumni of Cal Poly Humboldt, and she has a Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of New Mexico School of Law. Judge Abby served as a commissioner for the San Francisco Superior Court for over 17 years. And in 2020, Judge Abby was recognized with the Lawrence R. Baca Lifetime Achievement Award by the Indian Law Section of the Federal Bar Association for dedicating her career to integrating Native values in the justice system. And in 2023, Judge Abby was selected as the North Coast Woman of the Year. So we are thrilled to have her. After we hear from Judge Abby, we will turn it over to our visiting scholar today, Dr. Dana Lloyd, to speak about her work. Dr. Lloyd is an assistant professor of global interdisciplinary studies and affiliated faculty at the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University. She is the author of Land is Kin, Sovereignty, Religious Freedom, and Indigenous Sacred Sites, published by the University Press of Kansas. Land is Kin demonstrates the complexity of land in contemporary religious, political, and legal discourse. By drawing on Indigenous perspectives on the land as kin, Lloyd points toward a framework that shifts sovereignty away from binary oppositions between property and sacred site, between the federal government and Native nations, towards seeing the land itself as sovereign. I'm so excited to hear about your book. All right, that is it from me. Judge Abby, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
You're a hard act to follow. In any event, I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I'm very pleased with the book. And what I want to say mostly about it is it does give you a sense of how to think through problems and how you're here in this place, have certain rules, certain forces, but you can't lose what we know about the one thing I learned being out of it was the state system Whereas if you even go into these systems, at some point you might have to say, you know what, that's not what I'm going to. Why won't you? This is what you're supposed to do. Really? I wasn't very clear when I'm done. But that is why God made a flesh for us. And so you have to just look at things like that something. And what this book is telling you is that there's a different way to think your problem than what you gave here. This is important, something in the middle. But when we're talking about one with skin, we really need that changes how you think your problem. So you may fight with your parents. Be that as it may, we all go forward together every day. We're not survived here because we ran here. But what we've learned in the process since that time is that that work then, it will not work again. Because now people who came here, the invaders who came here, have been here for about 175 years, and they have managed so much trash again that we did not trash for thousands of years. So what does that tell you? What that tells you is we need to help them learn how to be in this place, and we need to go forward together. And that's what this is about, is going forward together. And why you should do it. Look inside yourself. Because it isn't just us that has that belief system. Because if you look back behind you, where you came from, before the Industrial Revolution, we were all people who lived in the villages. But trust me, when you're going to go, you don't act right. Because if you don't, everybody knows. With that, come she will help you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know a break is coming to you, so I really doubly appreciate you being here. I want to thank Caitlin and Samgita, and of course Judge Abby and Laura and Lori who came here, and all of you. I will not do a land acknowledgement, but I'll tell you that I'm coming to you from Lenape-Hocking, Philadelphia or Villanova, just outside of Philadelphia. And Katja did come over there last year and gave her land acknowledgement talk, and pulled up a link for everyone to donate, by the way, within the room. It was pretty powerful, so maybe you should start doing that. Tonight is all about kinship, so I brought the creature who was born between the time that I finished writing the book and the book came out, and he's more important to me than all of this, so maybe he'll be disruptive, but I will let him. But maybe he will not, I don't know. So let me start. I'll actually say, because I'm anticipating some disruption, I also don't mind if people want to comment or ask things while I'm talking. I'm open to that. I don't, yeah. So I'll start. Okay. What? Should I just put it closer to me or go there?
Well, the microphone will go to Zoom. It won't impact this room, I think.
Try to speak loud.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll try and be louder. So I'll tell you that this is the picture that's on the cover of the book, and it's a picture of the High Country taken by Charlie Tom, a man who was very involved in the activism around the case that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. The permissions to use it were given to me by Michael, his son, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I guess I'll also say one last thing before I start. I'm a little self-conscious about, like, I don't know who you all are, but I imagine there's a lot of people here who know about this more than I do. So, again, I'm going to say what I know and what I think, and I'm very, very open to conversation about it. Yeah. Okay, so the high country is a forest of Douglas fir trees taller than 300 feet, where pre-human ancestors called the Woge reside. Indigenous doctors train, gather medicine, make medicine. It's the sacred homeland of the Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa nations. And it is managed by the U.S. Forest Service as the Six Rivers National Forest. It is among the Siskiyou Mountains in Northern California, and the area includes Peak 8, Doctor Rock, Chimney Rock, and Elk Valley. I guess starting in the, let's say, the middle of the 20th century, the Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa nations argued in court, well, first of all, in front of the Forest Service and then in various courts against the plan of the Forest Service to cut 733 million board feet of the trees that I mentioned in the high country. The plan was to cut them over 80 years, to build a logging road. Specifically, the part of the road that was in question in the case was the final 6-mile section connecting two parts of the road. The road is known as the Go Road because it was supposed to connect two towns, Gasquet and Orleans. Sorry. And what they're saying in court is that the thing that the Forest Service refers to as developing the high country actually is going to irreparably impair their ability to practice their religion in the area. And they're saying we have the right to the free exercise of our religion granted to us by the US Constitution and by the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. So the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. They won in the two lower courts, in the trial court and in the Court of Appeals, and then they lose in the Supreme Court. The decision, the decision is from 1988. It is known as Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association. And I guess the question that really bothered me when I first read this case was, well, I guess two questions. So the Supreme Court gets requests to hear and decide maybe 700 cases a year, and it chooses about 10% of them. So it hears arguments and makes decisions about, let's say, 70 cases each year. And I was very perplexed by how this case was chosen, right? We're talking about 6 miles in the middle of a forest that probably for these justices is the middle of nowhere. And they waste one of the 70 cases to hear this case. Another thing that happens even before it arrives in their into the Supreme Court is that the California Wilderness Act, and I'll talk about it a little later, basically protects the area from development. So the case is moot. Like whatever the court decides, the road will probably not be built. The trees will probably not be cut. So it was really curious to me why they take the case, and also even maybe more so, how come the nation lose this case? It seems like such an easy case, and I think this is why the resources were put into it, right? Like this is why they went to court, because it was so clear that it's an easy case to win. And I guess I should tell you where I'm coming from to this case. So I grew up in Tel Aviv, in Israel-Palestine, and it's a very different but also very similar settler colonial context, right? I guess some striking differences that I will tell you are, one, in Israel-Palestine, the fact that the land is sacred is obvious to everyone. There's no question about the sacredness of land. There's also no question about the violence that the sacredness justifies, as we have seen in the past 5 weeks, right? So the fact that someone needs to go to court and say this land is sacred to me and we should do something about it, or avoid doing something about it, is something that you don't see back there, where I come from, right? The other thing is that the Israeli state is not a secular state. There's no separation of church and state. And so the idea that the court or the government may say, well, the fact that this is sacred to you matters to us or doesn't matter to us, right? Like, is also not something that you see over there, right? Like the state can say, well, this is a Jewish state and now it's a Jewish holiday, so all non-Jews are excluded from this place, and there's no, it's legal and constitutional, right? The other thing that I'll say is that I guess in the US, maybe the thing that is most sacred is the right of private property, which is supposedly not so in Israel-Palestine. I think this is all kind of like on the surface, because I think, you know, like the US is one of the most religious nations, right? Like we talk about the separation of church and state, but actually it is a very religious nation. Israel-Palestine, this idea of private property not being as important as religion, you know, is it becoming a more and more neoliberal state? Is becoming less true, right? So maybe the contexts are not as different. But when I come to this case, these are the things that this is my context. So I'm thinking to myself, you know, maybe if I make sense of this case, I'll make sense of America. And I'll make sense of my own, you know, troubled country that I'm coming from, right? So in order to answer these questions that I had about how come the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case and how come the nations lost in the Supreme Court, I thought I probably needed two things. In case you don't know, this is a landmark case. It means that every first-year law student reads it, or parts of it. It means that there's hundreds of law review articles that have been written about it. Almost all of it, with the exception of like, you know, a couple articles, dissect the nuances of how Justice Sandra Day O'Connor talks about religious freedom and the First Amendment, and does kind of like, you know, these legal word plays and things like that. It did not, reading these articles did not help me to figure out what I wanted to figure out. So I thought I needed more. I needed more than reading the Supreme Court decision and more than reading the scholarship about it. I knew that the trial was really long. It was 2 weeks or so. The court heard a lot of witnesses. The evidence in the case was robust. Like there was this report that the government produced that's maybe 500 pages that includes like ethnographic work and historical work and archaeological work. So there's a lot of stuff that you don't find any resonance of in the Supreme Court decision in the scholarship about the case. So I thought, I should find all this and I should read it, and maybe I'll find out more things. And when I started reading, I realized that there's another thing that I need to do. That all this discourse on religious freedom and critiques of religious freedom are just not enough, and I should maybe look elsewhere. And this elsewhere, or the theoretical framework that I discovered would be more helpful is the framework of indigenous sovereignty. So I had a lot of reading to do, and after all this reading, and after visiting Clement and talking to Judge Abby and talking to Laura and talking to Lori and talking to other people, Chris Peters, who was very involved and was a named plaintiff in the case, and others, I came to the argument that you can find in the book. I guess Caitlin kind of mentioned it. I think that cases about Native American sacred sites in general, beyond the Lynn case, beyond the Go Road, and especially when the sacred sites are on public land or government-owned land, what they do is, and this is how the rights discourse works always, right? Like, is that they pit against each other as mutually exclusive two rights: the right to religious freedom, or and the right to property. And then, as a result, two different competing conceptions of land as sacred as in property, right? So if land is sacred, it cannot be owned, because this is not how we think about the sacred, right? Like, we don't think about it as something that we can buy, as something that is ours, right? It's something beyond that. But also, as we will see in the Supreme Court decisions, if the land is already private property or public property in this case, then the fact of its sacredness can't matter practically to us. And I guess that because of where we are, and because that liberal political rights discourse thinks of property as the paradigmatic right, and of land as the paradigmatic property, then of course religion is going to lose, right? Of course the property is going to win. But actually, when I read all of the things that I read, what I saw is that land plays many different roles in the Go Road case, not just as property and as sacred. And it actually, all of these roles that land plays can live together. They're not mutually exclusive. And specifically, kinship seems to be robust and capacious enough to include all of these other things, right? Like, well, I'll say something about it later. So I guess the point is that if we see land in this complicated, complex, multifaceted way, right, as doing many things as at once, there's a better chance that we can treat the land and the people who live on the land better than we do. Okay. So the book has 5 chapters, and each chapter looks at one idea about land that I find in this case and its aftermath. Land is home, land is property, land is sacred, land is wild, and land is king, right? Yeah. Yes. Chapter 1 reads testimonies and evidence in the Go Road trial, and find there an argument about the land as home. Yeah, this is not good for you to touch. I guess let's this is a tiny part of the testimony of Lorena Brantner, who's a Yurok elder at the time, whose testimony was very powerful and clearly affected the Judge Rieger. I can only bring a tiny fraction of it, but let's read it. We didn't know that the BIA, even though we had a treaty, which we didn't know later that it was not ratified, and it's something that we will need to talk about soon. We gave all we had promised way beyond the mountains for them and for the land that we were to have in there, to keep our homes. In that way, we lost everything, and now we're standing on the last feet. So what she's saying is, responds to another question that I'll touch upon. Why, if this land is so sacred to 3 nations, why is it not part of any of their reservations? This is not a question that the court asks at any point. And it has something in front of it. So again, like just in case you don't know, when you go to trial, you hear witnesses, all the things that you see in TV court dramas, right? Like you hear witnesses, and there's all the adversarial process happens right in front of us, and the lawyers interrogate the witnesses, and all these things happen. By the time the case gets to the Supreme Court doesn't hear these people talk at all, right? Like it has access to the transcripts of the trial, to all the motions and decisions that courts below made, to the evidence that was submitted, right? It has access to all the texts that I had access to. I imagine these justices yes, they have interns, clerks, and they read some of this, right? So supposedly someone would have read this and asked themselves what treaty Loana is talking about, and what does it mean that they lost everything and now they're standing on the last peak, right? So I'll just say a couple things about it, right? So as you probably know, California Indians signed 18 treaties with the United States. None of these treaties were ratified, which means that there's no treaty to rely on if you want to come and say, if we're talking about indigenous sovereignty, and maybe some may say sovereignty is about treaty rights, it's not available here. But it starts to explain how, there was a treaty. People say, okay, I'll give you this part of the land. In return, you'll give me food, you'll give me education, you'll give me money, whatever it is, right? Then you give the land, and you don't receive anything in return. And so the land now is not yours, but there's also no treaty, right? Like, so all of this in this one little sentence, right? We need to do a lot of work to read into what she's saying here, but also what she's saying here in this last part about standing on the last peak refers to an argument that the government kept making about the fact that the high country is actually not that sacred to the Europe, Karuk, and Toroa because they don't use it that much, right? So a lot of the questioning of the witnesses was about, have you been there? How many people go there every year? When was the last time someone actually went there, right? Part of what you hear when you actually listening to the witnesses, I'll say that I'm not keeping track of time, so if someone wants to ever tell me to shut up, I'll shut up. So the witnesses explain, right, like the area is not accessible and not supposed to be accessible to everyone. That sometimes you need to go there and you can't go there because of the weather, right? Like it's not accessible, you can't get there. And sometimes people die because they couldn't go there to communicate with the creator and get the powers that they needed, right? Or get whatever it is that they needed. That's not convincing to a culture that thinks of sacredness in a very different way, right? Like I go to church on Sunday and that's my religiosity or something like that, right? I'm not necessarily convinced by this because like I'm Jewish. If I were a practicing Jew, it's not like I can go into every part of the synagogue and touch the Torah scroll, right? I don't have access to the most sacred things of my religion, my imagined religion. So I don't think that it's that different, but I think it's really easy to pretend that it's that different that you don't understand, right? But so to the argument that the area is not that sacred as they claim, she says, well, maybe we had other sacred sites, but we lost all of them. You've already destroyed them. You killed us. You burned our houses. You cut down the trees. You did all of this. And this is the last area that we have left. So it's more sacred than it maybe used to be, just because it's the last thing that we have. Okay, but she also said that we did all that because we wanted to keep our homes, right? Like, and maybe later we will look at other parts of the testimony, but this idea that the high country is Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa home comes back again and again, and doesn't have any resonance in any of the court decisions. Even the district court, where I'm telling you the judge was really touched by what he hears. That's not what he writes about in his decision, and it has a lot to do with the religious freedom framework that asks the judges to decide something very specific, right? They can't include everything that they heard, but to me, it meant that I want to read the case against this kind of discourse about the indigenous home or domestication that was available to me. I guess I was planning to talk about it later, but maybe I'll say something about it. First of all, in the Marshall Trilogy, the 3 cases that begin federal Indian law in the 1820s and 30s, Chief Justice John Marshall invents this thing called domestic dependent nations. So again, we're in the sphere of sovereignty, right? Like if, and I won't go into the details of any of these cases, but if we have a question of standing, right, like if there's a dispute between native nations and, for example, states, can the Supreme Court decide cases like this, right? But what is the status of native nations, right? Are they foreign nations, fully sovereign, or are they like more like states, or are there something else? And he kind of like, if we think of sovereignty as something that's absolute, he says, no, they have some relative sovereignty or relative authority. They are part of the US, but also not exactly, right? And he calls it the domestic dependent nations. So this is one meaning of domestication that I'm working with here. The other 2 are related to each other. They are about domesticating the savage, right? Like kill the Indian to save the man. And the other is that attacks on indigenous sovereignty in this assimilation era were done through the indigenous home. So going into the indigenous home and stealing kids and sending them to boarding school, right? And later on, putting them up for adoption. All of that are things that we need to consider when we think about the Go Road case as a case about indigenous home, right? So this is, I guess, what chapter 1 does. The next chapter goes into the Supreme Court decision and reads the majority opinion written by Sandra Day O'Connor. And she says, whatever rights the Indians may have to the use of the area, those rights do not divest the government of its right to use what is, after all, its land. Obviously, what we have here is an idea about land as property, right? As I said, there's no questioning of how come this area became government property. There's no questioning, about whether we should recognize it as government property. Maybe we shouldn't. Nothing like that. We will look at how she starts her decision a little later, maybe to explain some things. But this is what chapter 2 kind of does, wanting to read what it means land as property. A lot of, I think, a lot of the discourse that's in play here relies on like ethnographic work that says, Europe people didn't have property ownership systems and things that are totally wrong, right? Like romanticizing and essentializing indigenous peoples as relating to the land in this like way that is everything but owning property. But also also, again, going back to this Marshall trilogy, the first, maybe most famous case, Johnson v. McIntosh, that brings the doctrine of discovery, which is a Catholic doctrine, into American law, and says, well, the U.S. has a right, basically, to all of this land because it inherited it from European nations that had a right of discovery, right? So what we had here was pagans and Christian nations came and discovered the land and had the right given them by the Pope to enslave and do and kill, right? Like, and do lots of bad things to people who are not Christian. Justice Marshall knows that he can't use these words, pagans and Christian, in a U.S. court. So he switches to Europeans and savages. And part of the savagery means or is about Native Americans not being able to cultivate the land in a way that would allow them to have property in the sea, right? So when O'Connor writes this decision about land as property, and not just property, but government property, she's in conversation with all of these, like, almost 200 years of federal Indian law. None of it is in the case, right? So like, he relies on lots of precedent, like cases that are about sacred sites or about religious freedom. But actually what you're telling us is that you're deciding the case based on this idea of property, not about sacredness, right? So this is what this chapter wants to do, or how kind of like the critique that it offers. The next chapter, Land is Sacred, reads Justice Brennan's dissent in the case. So Justice Brennan writes a dissenting opinion that is usually celebrated as politically progressive and legally correct. Again, I brought one sentence where he said, because of their perceptions of and relationship with the natural world, Native Americans consider all land sacred. For him, this is reason enough to have them win the case. He also said, you know what I told you, this is like 6 months, like, there's no reason, there's no compelling interest for the government to damage a religion that's all right. Like, we have a religion that's at least as old as this nation, he says, right? But maybe it's 5,000 years old. And you can justify the majority opinion, right? So I agree that it's, his opinion is better than O'Connor's, which is super racist, right? And again, we will look at some of her wording later. But also look at this sentence, because of their perception of relationship with the natural world, Native Americans consider all land sacred. Again, this is a romanticizing, essentializing idea about Native nations. There's no reference here, even though he does better than O'Connor, right? Like in referring to the Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa nations by name, not calling them Indians, right? Like saying he's capable of saying Native American, right? Like he really is convinced that their relationship to the high country is important enough and deserves protection. And yet he participates in this trend that courts do all the time when the indigenous subject is coming before them, right? Looking at them as this something that's attached to the past, that's not changing. They've always considered all the land sacred, right? There's no difference basically between the high country and any other part of the land. There's no difference that settler colonialism made within this relationship, right? Like, they've always thought that way. They've always lived there, which they have, right? But none of it is acknowledged in the opinion. And what happens to religion, if we do want to take seriously for a minute that this is a case about religion, what happens to religion in his dissenting opinion is that it's depoliticized. Essentially, it's depoliticized. So what the chapter wants to do is to put all of this in conversation with the civilization regulation, right? So we have over half a decade that ended not that long before this case, in which indigenous religions are criminalized in the US, right? You can't do your ceremony without really risking everything, right? Risking your life. So thinking about that, right? Like thinking about religion in this more politicized way, and also thinking about this American Indian Religious Freedom Act that again is really important to the case, and that O'Connor says, well, it's just a kind of declaration that Congress gives us. It doesn't really have to. We can't enforce it. Well, if you go and you look at the history of the legislation of this act, you learn that it's the Forest Service that pushed for this no-clip idea because of the Go Road. They knew that the Go Road is in the courts. They knew that this legislation can really ruin it for them. And they had enough power to push against making this law mean anything. Right? So nothing of this sort you will find in Brennan's opinion, and so you can find it in chapter 3, I guess. The next chapter is about wilderness, and I guess you talked a little bit about wilderness in your opening remarks, but what happened while the case is making its way through the courts is that I guess I didn't mention that the plaintiffs in the original trial were these 3 nations or individuals who are tribal members, and also some environmental organizations. And these environmentalists, when they see that they're going to lose, they have also a lot of power, and they go and lobby to make this area part of the California Wilderness. That's enacted in 1984. And so they succeed. And what happens is that, as I mentioned before, this area, by the time the case reaches the Supreme Court, the area is protected from the wilderness. It is considered wilderness. And now the nations are alone in front of the court, right? And the court decides the case as a case about only about religious freedom, because there's no reason to talk about anything environmental or anything like that. And you may say it's great, right? Isn't it great? Like they got what they wanted. Who cares how the high country stands? But it does matter, and it matters for 2 reasons. One is that I don't think we should trust the wilderness discourse, because it's exactly the discourse that did a lot of the work of dispossessing these people, right, of these lands. As I mentioned, right, this conception of Native Americans is not being able to cultivate land and is wild themselves, right? All of this. The land is terra nullius, right? It's empty. There wasn't any Christians here, so we can take it. So that's one part of the critique. The other part is, once this is wilderness, it is managed by the forest, right? It attaches the land to the government, not to the tribes, right? Like it didn't do anything. In terms of, if we think again, if you agree with me that this case is at least among other things about indigenous sovereignty, it doesn't have to be only about sovereignty, but if it's also about sovereignty, then wilderness is not the way we want to go, right? Okay, finally, chapter 5 looks at what's happening about 30 years after the case. And my guess is that you know about it because it's right here and it's happening right now. But in 2019, the Europe Tribal Council issues this resolution to recognize the Klamath River as a rights-bearing person. This chapter argues that what's in the basis at the basis of this resolution is an marking of the river, but of land, like more generally of the natural environment as kin. And that this is the reason to work. This is the reason we need to protect it. And I guess when this resolution first came out, I'll read this opening sentence to you. The Yurok Tribal Council now establishes the rights of the Klamath River to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve, to have a clean and healthy environment free from pollutants, to have a stable climate free from human-caused climate change impacts, and to be free from contamination by genetically engineered organisms. So this is really exciting, but also seems a little theoretical. Like, I don't know, I couldn't imagine Warren Buffett coming into Judge Abbott's court, right? But also 5 minutes later, the dams are being demolished, right? Like, so it worked. So I was very, very excited to be able to write about the dam removal and the conclusions of the book, because it was like the book was done, right? Like everything was in like copy editing stage or something, and then it's actually happening. And I remember visiting in like 2019, and Laura telling me next year it's happening, right? And he told me, well, every few years we think it's coming, and but in 2020 it happened. It won't happen. So it took a little, like it took a pandemic, right? But it's happening. And the book actually ends not with kinship, but with sovereignty and thinking about the land itself as sovereign. So I guess saying two things. I'm going to skip all this. And, I thought I had a picture of the river. It would have been nice to look at, but I don't. I think I'll finish by saying two things. One, about the land as sovereign, and how actually the river and thinking about water rights was really productive for me in thinking about this. Part of the thing is that water doesn't care. It's all about state boundaries. And so if actually this, writing this book, I went through two shifts. One is from thinking that religious freedom is productive to thinking mostly about indigenous sovereignty. And then from thinking about sovereignty as this power or authority or right to decide the fate of a place and people, to thinking about it more as partnership with the land. And actually even maybe more moving away from this idea of stewardship and thinking of the land as taking care of us and deciding it for us, right? Like, so thinking about water was really helpful in this direction. The other thing that I'll say that I think is true for the whole, for all these chapters, is that all these spheres, the home, the family, the sacred, the wild, and private property, are spheres that have served as tools of colonization. And that in the link case, we see them actually being used as tools of resistance. Maybe most of all, I'd say going into federal courts to argue against your colonizer, right? Like, it seems like it must be counterproductive because it acknowledges the sovereignty of the US. Otherwise, why do you go into the courts to make your arguments? But actually, when you look at what's happening in the trial, and that's one of the most exciting things about this work for me, is that what's happening when you're listening to these testimonies, and I was planning to read more, but you can read them in the book, is that Indigenous law and Indigenous sovereignty are taking place in the courtroom. All these stories that the witnesses tell are part of Yurok, Haruk, and Torah law, and are part of ceremony. So they are enacting religious freedom, and they are enacting Indigenous law within the courtroom, and it's now part of like public record, right? So we all have access to it as part of federal law, and I think that to me that was one of the most powerful things to see within the trial. So I'm going to end here. Take the disruptive baby away. But very excited for conversations, and thank you for listening.